Well, to discuss the Israeli military report on its soldiers killing those 3 captives, I'm joined now by military analyst Elijah Magnier. Good to have you with us, sir, joining us from Brussels. Can we just talk about Israel's rules of engagement and what they are? Because now we're seeing civilians, Palestinian civilians, being shot, killed and targeted. And now we're seeing Israeli captives also being shot and killed without any sort of questioning of who they are, it seems.
Well, I think the Israeli version of the army was not ready to see its soldiers that were in captivity walking around. Is quite silly. It depends on the objectives and the professionalism and the respect of international laws that are taught to the army in engaging in a battlefield. So if the objectives were to liberate, not to execute the hostages, as it happened, the army would not flood the tunnels and would not go and kill anyone who is moving, even civilians, or their own soldiers carrying white flag, or they will not reject the ceasefire, which take us to the professionalism of the army and the instructions given to the army. From the professional point of view, it is obvious that the psychological effect of the warfare, being exposed to such an intense combat situation, is dearly affecting the psychology of the soldiers, increasing their anxiety, paranoia. We've seen how the special forces, the Golan Brigade, went in the Shujaiya, and in the last 48 hours, they've lost 20 men, including the head of the unit and several officers. So we understand from that the soldiers are on edge. They're no longer confident. They are afraid of the effectiveness of the Palestinian resistance.
Mr. Magnier, can I just jump in there? We certainly get a sense of what you're saying. Just a few days ago, we saw IDF footage of them parading half-naked Palestinian men with their hands on their head, searching them for weapons and paraded as captives. There, the Israelis felt they were safe, that they had half-naked men, some in their underwear, and no threat. Yet these men were also half-naked, walking across a battlefield with white flags, and yet they were treated very differently. You talk about professionalism. There's incompetence here as well, is there not?
It's a very high level of incompetence and also depend on the circumstances. Those the Israelis have shown as half-naked, they went into the school and arrest them and ask them to strip off. So they knew who they were dealing with. In this case, the 3 soldiers, they are professionals. They understand that they have to take off their shirts to make sure that the army understand they're not coming with bombs and suicide bombers. They're not going to attack them, and they're raising white flag. The situation is completely different. The first one is at ease. The soldiers went in and they understood they're all civilians. And the second case, they were confronted with a real battlefield, and they showed how their lack of training, how their lack of confidence, but above all, what you rightly mentioned at the first beginning, the rule of engagement. So what is the rule of engagement that are giving to the army in the battlefield? Kill anyone who is moving.
And indeed, does this sort of behaviour breach the Geneva Convention, or does Israel work on a different premise, one being the Hannibal Doctrine?
The Hannibal Doctrine would apply when the Israeli know that there is a certain route or a location where there are the hostages and the kidnappers. In this case, it doesn't apply because they are confronted with a situation where had they respect international law and the Geneva Convention, they would have acted in a very cold approach, asking the 3 soldiers to be on the floor and come and inspect them, or even from a distance, to understand who they were dealing with. But because they are killing indiscriminately any person in Gaza, and that is the objective of the operation, is not to liberate the prisoners, as Benjamin Netanyahu said, but to destroy Gaza and its inhabitants. Because had the objective were rightly, as Netanyahu said at the first beginning, we want to cripple Hamas capability and liberate our prisoners, the army would not have shot the three men because they were in looking for the prisoners and not looking how to execute them.
Elijah Magnier joining us from Brussels. Thank you so much for your analysis. So let's bring in Noureddine Miladi, Professor of Media and Communication at Qatar University. He's also the author of the global media coverage of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Good to have you with us back on the programme. Let's just talk about the media coverage of this particular incident, because now you've got the Israeli media really focusing on their own being killed by their own. And there are media organisations and countries across the world who have, you might say, been a little bit more sympathetic to the Israeli position, who can't ignore this and will have to report that the Israelis really didn't know what they were doing and killed their own.
I mean, this is obviously has nothing to do with professionalism. It has to do with revenge and the way the Israeli government and its media apparatus are trying to market or kind of disseminate information about this act of revenge. All of the civilians we've been seeing on international, global screens, I think it does remind about Abu Ghraib. It does remind about the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, and the way civilian people have been kind of dehumanized when they were stripped off their clothes. There are lots of accounts of families and women who said how men were separated. Those people are civilians. There is no proof for the Israeli government to show that those people, any of them, has been carrying weapons, any arms, or they are a threat to anyone.
But there is a level of incompetence, isn't there, here, in the sense that you do not brief your soldiers correctly in even recognising potential Israeli captives in a war zone, as they describe it, who may become free. And that option, that alternative in briefings just wasn't even considered.
No, absolutely. I mean, and this is not, by the way, the first mistake or the first kind of catastrophe by the Israeli army. I mean, there are many of them. There are now accounts that on the 7th of October, there was also another catastrophic event where Apaches, they actually hit Israeli settlers where Hamas people and others invaded the place. So I think this is not the first instance. I think there are lots of instances, but this is an accumulation of the malfunctionality, not only between the communication, but also the lack of professionalism in the Israeli army. We've been kind of hearing accounts of this is the most professional army in the world, the most well-trained army in the world, and we have proofs in front of us. They couldn't even capture one person from the people who are wanted by the Israeli government.
And so now we go back to, you might say, the negotiating table, because we're now seeing talks between Israel and interlocutor Qatar to talk about either release of captives or another ceasefire. How are you reading the situation right now?
Well, I think it's complex, and there is a kind of conflicting information, to be honest. I mean, we hear a message from the US, from the Biden administration. Also, we hear a slightly different message from the Israeli government. But for sure that the Qatari broker, they are doing their best to kind of come to a certain conclusion to the catastrophe that is befalling on the Palestinian people. The Qatari government has been kind of behind the scenes doing a huge amount of diplomacy, kind of networking and works between the US, the Egyptians, but also the Israelis in general. And we know and we see it, I mean, whether in the media or whether on other platforms. So I think unfortunately, the picture now is still vague. But what we know exactly for sure and what we see in front of us, whether on social media and so forth, is the continuation of the bombardment, the annihilation of Palestinian people, whether in Gaza or in the West Bank and other Palestinian cities.
Well, we'll be unpicking more of what's going on, certainly, as the evening progresses. For the moment, Noureddine Miladi, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.